Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by again. Look, this video is going to be part of a series about why capitalism is bad. And so for that first video, I wanted to jump in with one of the most pernicious myths about capitalism, which is that it's directly connected to democracy. Put another way, many people associate democracy and capitalism. They say that all democratic societies are capitalist, and that most, if not all, capitalist societies are democratic. And I want to talk about why that's wrong. We have to realize that capitalism in and of itself doesn't require democracy. Often people will associate capitalism with freedom and liberty and equality of opportunity, saying that, it's the capitalist system that gives us all of those things. But in reality, what capitalism is above all is the extraction of surplus wealth from working people and the primacy of private property in that process, owned by a capitalist class. None of that requires free markets. None of that requires political democracy. None of that requires, freedom of the press. None of that requires quote-unquote competition, whatever that means. None of that is required at all. At the end of the day, it's a system based on private property and the exploitation of workers. And that can work in some cases within elements of liberal democratic capitalism, but other times it works through more authoritarian systems, and it's just as capitalist. And so it's important to let people know that things like democracy, things like markets, things like liberties, things like rights, those aren't inherent to the capitalist system. And in fact, I would argue those things are hampered by the existence of capitalism. Equality of opportunity, personal and political liberty, all of those are greater without a system of deep economic concentration and exploitation. Another factor here is that when we talk about democracy, we talk about it in an extremely limited sense. In countries like Canada and the United States and many others, we talk about marking an X on a ballot every so often. Whether it's for your local or your statewide or your national leadership, every once in a while you'll get to mark an X for your politician of choice, and they will go to, political office and make decisions for you. And very rarely in Canada, more often in the United States, you'll get to vote on a particular ballot measure, and you'll have a voice in that sense. But for the most part, your day-to-day role in democracy is extremely limited because political democracy isn't sufficient. When we talk about democracy from a left perspective, from a democratic socialist perspective, what we really mean is not only the preservation of that political democracy, and in some cases the expansion of it, but the realization that democracy matters in the workplace, and democracy matters in the community, and democracy matters in the commanding heights of the economy. Capitalism rejects all of that. Capitalism will tolerate political democracy, although when backed into a corner, it will choose authoritarianism over democracy to preserve capitalism. But socialists will say, conversely, that it's not enough to mark that X. We have to ask ourselves, what does it mean when 3 people control more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans? Is that a democratic society? All of those bottom 50% of people, most of them, get to vote, and their votes add up to more than those 3 billionaires and the families of those billionaires, certainly. But in terms of their influence on the economy, on media, on the ability to shift the entire destinies of not only companies, but regions, nations in some cases, the power pales in comparison. And so a socialist would suggest that the commanding heights of the economy cannot be privately owned. The very biggest industries, the most strategic industries, if they are privately controlled, they imperil democracy. We would also suggest that when workers do not have effective control in their workplace, through things like unions, yes, but also through cooperative and worker ownership of those industries, those workplaces are mini autocracies. They're mini oligarchies. And so it's very weird from my perspective that we live in societies in Western Europe, Canada, the United States, and many others that cherish democracy, that cherish this idea that everybody is equal and that we have a democratic society, and yet for 8 hours a day minimum, 40 hours a week, sometimes longer for some people, we go into workplaces that are mini autocracies. especially if they're non-union workplaces, especially if you're a contingent worker, you're a precarious worker. You have very little freedom and equality and democracy at the place where you spend a third of your life, which is your workplace. It matters much more in a day-to-day sense than your ballot vote that you made 6 months, 2 years, 4 years ago. If you're electing a senator 5, 6 years ago. Canada, we have elections, some cases once only every 5 years at a given jurisdictional level. The reality is that that's where democracy is needed most, and that's where we don't have it. Because capitalism is predicated, again, not on freedom, not on the free exchange of goods, not on competition, none of that. It's based on the private control of industry for the interests of those who control that industry through their private means, and no one else. That's what capitalism is. At times, in certain places, capitalist societies have had a broader vision. They have reformed themselves. They have included things like universal health care. But almost always due to the pressure of the working masses and of the labor movement and of left politicians who have really tried to shake things up. They have forced that decision upon capitalists because capitalists were given a choice. We give a little bit to the working people, or the working people will take what they deserve, which is everything. So capital's like, give them something or they'll take everything. Of course they'll give them something. This is the post-war labor reforms. This is, neoliberal capital at times throwing a bone with something like Obamacare, even though it was woefully inefficient, and on and on and on. The point is, none of that is done through benevolence, and none of that is actually done through the democratic imposition of capitalism. Capitalism resists democratic impulses. So I want you guys to know that, and I want you guys to tell people this, because I really feel this is one of the biggest myths that justifies capitalism in the hearts of so many. That it's synonymous with democracy in countries like Canada and the United States. But it isn't. It doesn't have to be. Capitalism is a barrier to meaningful, broad-based democracy, both in a political and an economic sense. And if we want to build a democratic society, we have to do it through socialist means. We have to do it through a collective ownership of the means of production, not just through the state. State ownership is needed, of course, in certain cases, but through worker and cooperative means, and not just through the federal governments, but through state and municipal governments. That's what we need to build democracy, to ensure that in a day-to-day way, working people have a meaningful say over the things that affect their lives. And this decision, this need to move towards economic democracy will only become more important as automation continues at a faster and faster pace. Because automation isn't just about making a lot of working class people unemployed. That's certainly the case. Automation is ultimately about further concentrating economic power. Because when working people even have a decent living, they have something of a say within the operation of our society. When they're disenfranchised from their workplaces, as that power becomes further and further concentrated in the owners of those industries and a very small sliver of working elites that operate those industries, we will see that capitalism is even more autocratic, more oligarchic than it is today. We don't want to move towards that society. We need to ask ourselves, why is it okay that one private company can determine the entire fate of economic regions? Why is it okay that billionaires can distort our media through the purchase of newspapers? Why is it okay that they can distort our political process through massive donations? And why is it okay that whereas we have votes to elect our political leaders, we have very little say in electing those who run our industries? That's why capitalism is anti-democratic, and that's just one reason why capitalism is bad.